Hi, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to this virtual EUMOFA Talk, a series of talks where we invite experts to talk about cutting-edge topics in fisheries and aquaculture. My name is Maren, and I'm part of the EUMOFA team, the European Market Observatory for Fisheries and Aquaculture, and today I will be moderating this event. Before we continue, I would like to remind our participants that the audience will be muted and your cameras will be turned off for the entirety of this event. And this session is being recorded and will be made available on the EUMOFA YouTube channel. So during the last year, EUMOFA released the Blue Bioeconomy Report, which featured a study on integrated multi-trophic aquaculture and a separate study on recirculating aquaculture systems. Starting from these EUMOFA studies, today's talk will dive deeper into the current situation and give market perspectives for these specific aquaculture-related techniques, namely integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, it's a mouthful, so IMTA, and recirculating aquaculture systems, or Ras. This will be done thanks to the participation of a panel of experts, which you can see on the screen. Let me introduce them to you. We have Birgit van Tongelen. She works in the DG MARE, the Directorate General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries in the European Commission. We have Frank Kane, our IMTA experts from the Marine Institute in Ireland, and we have Jacob Bregnballe, our Ras expert from the Aqua Group in Denmark. So during the talk, our listeners are encouraged to send in questions to the experts in the chat. You can do this by writing in the chat box, and please specify who the questions are for. After the presentations, we will have a final Q&A sessions where we hope to answer all of your questions. So without much further ado, let's present our first speaker. Our first speaker is Birgit van Tongelen. She studied veterinary medicine in the Ghent State University in Belgium. After graduation, she practiced as a veterinarian in both the UK and in Belgium. In 2000, she joined the European Commission, where she worked in several services, among them DG Environment, DG Health and Food Safety, and DG Research. In 2018, she started working in DG MARE, where she joined the aquaculture team. She is mainly responsible for fish health, fish welfare, research and innovation, and organic aquaculture. Birgit, today you will be talking to us about the strategic guidelines for a more sustainable and competitive EU aquaculture. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Maren. Good morning, everybody. I will share my screen now. Okay. So good morning, everybody. I'm Birgit van Tongelen. I work in the European Commission in DG MARE in the aquaculture team. And today I will present the strategic guidelines for a more sustainable and competitive EU aquaculture. They were adopted by the Commission in May this year. The aim of these guidelines is to offer a common vision for the member states and for all relevant stakeholders for the further development of the aquaculture sector in the EU. And in addition to this common vision, the guidelines also propose specific actions for the Commission, for the member states, and for the Aquaculture Advisory Council. And the aim is then to make progress in several key areas that have been identified in the guidelines. Today, I will focus on Ras and IMTA, so recirculating aquaculture systems, and IMTA because this is the topic of the day. I will focus today on the particular aspects of Ras and IMTA in the strategic guidelines. But before, before starting this talk, I would like to remind you the new political context, notably the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork. The Farm to Fork strategy was adopted by the Commission in May 2020, and it calls for an accelerated transition to sustainable food systems. And the aquaculture sector has a role to play here, an important role to play here, I would say. Because in the Farm to Fork strategy, it is mentioned that farmed fish and seafood generate a lower carbon footprint than animal production on land. And in addition, the Farm to Fork strategy also sets specific targets for aquaculture, notably that the significant increase of organic aquaculture should be foreseen, and that there should be a 50% reduction of sales of antimicrobials in aquaculture by 2030. So in light of this new political context, the new guidelines were adopted by the Commission to achieve the objectives of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork. The new strategic guidelines present 4 horizontal objectives. First of all, building resilience and competitiveness of the EU aquaculture sector, ensuring that aquaculture participates in the green transition. A third objective is to ensure social acceptance of aquaculture and also provide appropriate information to the consumers. And the last objective is increasing knowledge and innovation in the aquaculture sector. Under those 4 horizontal objectives, the guidelines identify also 13 key areas where further work is needed. You can see here the 13 key areas of work are listed, like access to space and water, animal health, animal welfare. And for each of those key areas, there are also recommendations for action. In particular, relevant today when we are talking about RAS and IMTA, the key areas for action, diversification and environmental performance are important. They are highlighted here in red. And so RAS and IMTA are explicitly mentioned here in these key areas of work. For the key area diversification, the guidelines stress that EU aquaculture sector has a great scope for further diversification, notably diversification towards new species, in particular non-fed and low-trophic species like mollusks and other invertebrates like algae and also herbivorous fish. Also new production methods. And what is mentioned in the strategic guidelines is the polyculture in pond aquaculture, and also IMTA is explicitly mentioned here. And then there is also an opportunity for further diversification towards new products. And we mean hereby processed and ready-to-use products, which are attractive for the younger people, the younger consumers. For the key area environmental performance, a number of issues are mentioned in the guidelines to improve the environmental performance. As you can see here, ensure sustainable feed systems, reducing the use of veterinary products, but also promoting aquaculture systems with lower environmental impact, such as energy efficient recirculating aquaculture systems, IMTA, but also organic aquaculture is mentioned here. And then, as I said in the beginning, the strategic guidelines provide not only a common vision for the member states and the stakeholders for the further development of the aquaculture sector, but it also identifies concrete recommendations for actions for the Commission, but also for member states and for the Aquaculture Advisory Council. To improve the environmental performance of the sector, where, as I said, RAS and IMTA are mentioned, the following actions are listed. And in red, you can see the actions that are relevant for RAS and IMTA. First of all, the Commission will develop a guidance document on environmental performance in the aquaculture sector. And that guidance document that will include guidance on implementation of EU legislation. It will also include mapping of good practices, covering different issues like the use of sustainable feed, energy efficiency, carbon footprint, and also it will here touch upon RAS and IMTA. The second action is support the diversification of EU aquaculture to types of aquaculture with a better environmental performance, notably energy efficient RAS and IMTA. And then a third action for the Commission is support research and innovation to improve the environmental performance of the sector. Then we come to the actions for the member states. Here it is mentioned that member states should promote and disseminate the guidance document on environmental performance that is produced by the European Commission. So they should promote and disseminate it among authorities that are competent for aquaculture and also the aquaculture industry. And this could, for example, be done by trainings. Second action is also support the diversification of aquaculture to types of aquaculture with a better environmental performance, and also supporting research and innovation. And then for the Aquaculture Advisory Council, the action mentioned is that they should promote in the aquaculture sector the implementation of this guidance document on environmental performance, and also ensure that EU aquaculture producers are informed about relevant research and innovation to improve the environmental performance of the aquaculture operations. So how are we going to implement these guidelines? To support the implementation of the strategic guidelines, the Commission will set up an EU aquaculture assistance mechanism. And this will be a tool to help the Commission, the Member States, but also the industry and other stakeholders to develop guidance documents, including the guidance documents that I mentioned that will address RAS and IMTA. But there are also other guidance documents, for instance, on spatial planning, on climate change, on administrative procedures, etc. They will also help to consolidate best practices on the areas that are covered in this communication, and help to implement the guidance document and the best practices. Finally, I would like to mention that this assistance mechanism will also include a website with a knowledge base that will be accessible for all the stakeholders. And this knowledge base will, for instance, include an overview of all the relevant legislation on aquaculture, an overview of the EU funding opportunities for aquaculture, a database of good practices on different items, including RAS and IMTA, and also a database of EU-funded aquaculture projects. And here also projects on RAS and IMTA will definitely be included. Voila, this is in a nutshell, in a short, what I wanted to present to you today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Birgit. Very interesting. I actually had a couple of follow-up questions for you. The first one was, what is the timeline for implementing the actions from the Commission strategic guidelines on EU aquaculture, and then especially related to today's topic, RAS and IMTA?
Yeah, thank you, Maren. Concerning the two actions that I mentioned, the guidance document on environmental performance and the diversification, as I said, the Commission is in the process of setting up an assistance mechanism that will support the Commission, the Member States and the stakeholders with the implementation of the strategic guidelines. This assistance mechanism will be operational in May 2020, because we have launched now the call for tender. We will do the evaluations. So in May 2020, it will be operational. And then, of course, there will be a lot of topics to work on, but the guidance document on environmental performance is definitely a priority. So we think that by 2023, this document will be ready. And as I said, RAS and IMTA will definitely be included. Concerning the diversification to low-impact aquaculture production method, the Commission has already started to support this diversification. We are currently in the process of revising the draft national strategic plans for aquaculture that the Member States have to prepare for the period 2021-2027. And the Commission is making comments and is ensuring that diversification to low-impact aquaculture production methods is definitely included as much as possible in these strategic plans from the Member States. And the same goes for the operational programs that the Member States are preparing to receive funding from the European Maritime, Fishery and Aquaculture Fund for 2021-2027. So here also the Commission makes comments to include this diversification to low impact aquaculture.
Okay, thank you, Birgit. And you mentioned something about a fund. Is there EU funding for RAS and IMTA?
There is the European Maritime, Fishery and Aquaculture Fund, and so on the MFAF, like we call it. So under MFAF, it is possible for member states to support initiatives that are related to the transition to a more sustainable aquaculture, including IMTA and RAS. Given the fact that RAS systems are sometimes energy intensive, the Commission always makes the comment or recommends the member states that the support to those systems should be energy efficient and that they should use renewable energy sources. There is also, of course, funding under research and innovation projects that address also RAS and IMTA under different EU funding instruments, like Horizon 2020 has some projects on RAS and IMTA, and also Interreg. And in the future, there will definitely be more opportunities.
Okay, thank you. And just a bit more specific question for you, Birgit. Why does the EU organic regulation not allow for the use of RAS?
Indeed, closed RAS systems for organic production are prohibited, with the exception of hatcheries and nurseries. For example, in the case of organic salmon, salmon can only grow in closed RAS systems in the initial phase, so in the hatchery and the nursery. The reason behind this prohibition is that RAS is not in line with the organic principles, notably responsible use of energy, restricted use of external inputs, and also the high animal welfare standards. So in organic, they have to meet the species-specific behavioral needs of the animals. And that is often not respected in this case. Experts have highlighted that closed RAS systems have a lot of environmental advantages, but they are not in line with the organic principles, and that is the reason why it is prohibited. And maybe I can say that at this stage, the Commission does not intend to propose a modification of these provisions in the organic regulation.
Okay, thank you, Birgit, for those detailed answers. If there's anyone else who has more questions for Birgit, please write them in the chat, and we will have a final Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. So Birgit, thank you so much for sharing. We will now move on to our second presenter, Frank Kane. Let's see. There, thank you. All right, so to introduce our second expert today, Frank Kane. He is a marine biologist working with the Irish Marine Institute in their aquaculture section. His areas of research include aquaculture and aquaculture management, integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, the development of novel and lower trophic species in aquaculture, sea lice management, and environmental monitoring. He has previous experience with the salmon farming and shellfish sectors, and since 2018, he has been coordinating the Horizon 2020 Impact Project, which worked to develop an intelligent monitoring system to validate IMTA. So obviously today his talk will be about IMTA. Frank Kane, please go ahead.
Thank you, Maren. Hi, my name is Frank Kane. I work with the Marine Institute here in Ireland. So the Marine Institute are a state agency responsible for marine research, technology development and innovation in Ireland, and it provides scientific and technical advice to the government to inform policy and support sustainable development of Ireland's marine resources. I work in the aquaculture section, which works to monitor and develop around aquaculture, focus on the needs of the Irish aquaculture section. I'm currently coordinating the Horizon 2020 Impact Project, which has just come to an end. The Impact is a collaboration of 21 multidisciplinary international partners working to a common goal of developing and validating an intelligent management system for sustainable IMTA production and to validate the concept of IMTA as a viable farming practice. Here today, I will introduce the concept of IMTA and talk a little bit about what it is, the benefit potential it offers, and challenges that it faces. IMTA, or Imta, means Integrated Multi-Trophic Aquaculture, and it is a term to describe a specific concept in aquaculture. The concept itself is not new, but the term itself was coined in 2004 by Thierry Chopin at a conference in Canada. Professor Chopin works at the University of New Brunswick in Canada and would be an international champion of IMTA as such. But IMTA techniques would have been practiced for centuries in the Far East. Common examples would include fish and duck farmed in paddy fields and elements like that. Here in Europe, current aquaculture practices are predominantly single species monoculture farming. One species of fish is farmed on one site. So we have a salmon or sea bass farm, or a mussel farm or seaweed farm. So monoculture single species sites is the norm. And if you want to add another species, this would be called polyculture, where there is more than one species on a site. When we talk about IMTA, we're talking about a particular type of polyculture, and it requires to be growing two or more species, and for those species to be complementary to each other in some way. I'll elaborate on these as we go along. IMTA is a concept in aquaculture rather than a specific formula or practice or methodology. And within that concept, there are three elements. There's the aquaculture element, which is farming of aquatic organisms in the sea or in fresh water. And we're all somewhat familiar with aquaculture, such as fish, sea bass, trout in ponds, pins, tanks, and raceways, or shellfish and seaweed in various structures such as long lines, trestles, rafts. The second element is the multi-trophic element. This means the species must come from different levels on the food chain so that the energy, or in this case, the nutrients, can pass between the different levels being farmed. So the algae or plants are your primary producers. You're incorporating shellfish or filter feeders as your secondary layers, and fish are generally further up the chain as the upper trophic layers. And then the third element is the integrated element. And this is the key in the whole concept to bring it together. The species being farmed must be linked to each other in some biological way, serving complementary functions within the ecosystem. The idea is that the organic and inorganic waste from one species serves as nutritional inputs for other species. The fish are fed, which is adding to the system. The fish then excrete minerals and organic matter into the surrounding waters. In the current linear system, this is the end of the cycle, and the excretion is absorbed into the natural environment. So IMTA is looking to reduce the linearity of that system by taking the waste, which is currently a problem in the environment, and utilizing it as a product. The waste is reused as nutritional inputs for other species. Filter feeders such as oysters or mussels filter out the particulate waste as food, using it to grow, and seaweed or plants in the water absorb the nutrients from the water for themselves to grow. This more circular process reduces or eliminates the actual waste and has now become a byproduct or a co-product rather than a waste product. The model reduces the negative element or environmental impact and is using it to create a positive outcome in the process. So IMTA is mimicking the natural cycles within the oceans where animal and plants live in an everlasting circular ecosystem. So what does IMTA look like? Well, a typical IMTA setup might involve something like having fed fish in a pen, pond, or tank. The feeding of the fish is an addition to the system. The fed fish eat the food, and the rearing of the fish releases waste or nutrients into the surrounding waters. That's currently externalized and just goes off into the environment for the environment to deal with. There may be filter feeding layers such as mussels or scallops, which are adjacent to the pens, and they are filtered out and feed on the large particulate organic matter that comes within the water column. Then there is the plant or seaweed layer, and as this grows, it absorbs the minerals from the water for the plants to grow. In a more complex setup, you might involve a benthic element, so detrital feeders might be added, such as sea cucumber, annelid worms, or others that can be grown on the seabed, and they feed on the organic waste that falls to the bottom. So this whole setup is utilizing the waste from the fish entering the environment and reducing the overall additions to the system, reducing the overall environmental impact. Aquaponics, which is growing aquatic animals along with plants in water and utilizing the nutrient-rich aquaculture water, is a form of IMTA also. Indeed, it is likely that freshwater IMTA setups would be a simpler proposition where things can be more closed and be monitored more closely. So these restorative farming setups can be run safely and efficiently to reduce our environmental impact and to optimize space. The species being farmed must be chosen well, and they must be complementary to each other, deriving benefits from the arrangement somehow. And the setup should be advantageous in general to both the environment and to the farm. So the selection and positioning of the appropriate species is vital in this farm setup. But there is no one ideal IMTA system. It is a concept that can be applied to specific scenarios and is specific to each site. There is the typical one with filter feeders and algae on a site, but the idea of nutrient balancing across a larger area can also be considered, which may be more workable in many locations. So lots of the research suggests to get the direct benefits to species must be farmed in close proximity. But you can ask, does the nitrogen molecule inputted to the system have to be the same molecule that is removed by the seaweed? Or is it the overall input and extraction balance that is important and is what we're aiming for? So if I remove the same volume of nutrients from a location adjacent or on the other side of the bay, is that still beneficial? Or maybe even on the bay next door, if we're looking at this environmental balance. And this then makes the concept of IMTA bigger, and it opens the concept of nutrient trading and putting value on the benefits of these extractive species. There are a number of mentioned benefits to an IMTA setup. It produces more farm biomass from the same site area, better utilizing the space and the three-dimensional footprint of the site or the farm. Most importantly, it helps reduce impact on the environment from fish rearing, biomitigating or bioextracting to reduce risk of eutrophication and from dissolved and organic matter in the environment. Polyculture of multiple species creates a diversity of products for the farmer with more saleable products, reduce risk and increase profitability for the farm. It provides year-round harvestable crops, improving cash flow, and it's an efficient use of infrastructure labor, providing more species in the same setup. IMTA increases the diversity of crops being farmed and provides a habitat for a number of other species, at least in the short term, and as such contributes to the biodiversity and the good environmental status of the production environment. There's the potential for more marketable, environmentally friendly products. And IMTA makes aquaculture more socially acceptable among the general public and politically. The challenges to IMTA are largely economic, operational, and regulatory. There's an imbalance of income potential between the different trophic layers. Fish are much more profitable than seaweed, and this is a significant barrier to the adoption of the concept. Other trophic levels in an IMTA setup add complexity to the farm operations. Farmers are familiar and experts with their current monoculture system. Change is always a risk, and adding new species to your site is complicated and takes a lot of effort. It increases cost and effort. Studies suggest the complexity of multiple species on a site is undesirable and does not work well, which is true. But for it to work, we probably need to design an IMTA farm rather than adding species to our current farms. The design needs to consider each stock and species equally and to consider the logistics when giving all species and stocks priority on the site. It is likely that any farmer will not be happy if you add another species to their farm. So we need to be thinking about IMTA farmers rather than shellfish farmers or finfish farmers or seaweed farmers. An understanding of the species interaction is needed on the site and at a regulatory level. The size and footprint of the site may be bigger as a result of the extra species. And there is complexity in regulating multi-species sites. Farms are regulated by defined biological criteria, which gets more complex the larger, more multi-species site you have. In general, policy has been supportive of the concept of IMTA. In the EU in general, it is mentioned in the strategy for sustainable aquaculture, as well as a number of Horizon projects funded on the topic: Astral, Aquavita, Impact, Integrate, iDream, and then a number of other national projects ongoing in the various different countries. IMTA probably needs to be better considered at the member state level and in the aquaculture regulatory systems and the member state as to how we can do it and how we can regulate it. The one key benefit of IMTA that makes it something worthwhile doing in the aquaculture sector is bioremediation. The other benefits are beneficial, but they're unlikely drivers of the concept. Bioremediation is a major ecosystem service that IMTA provides. And for ecosystem services to be a driver, we need to be putting value on the ecosystem service of bioremediation of lower trophic species. This would be a key element in progressing the concept of IMTA. In many cases, seaweed or lower trophic species are relatively small economic value compared to finfish production. But changing the currency from economic value to ecosystem services or environmental benefits mean that these species offers real potential for the future. They offer potential to decouple economic growth from resource use, a potential to achieve sustainable, secure food from the sea, and a potential to farm quality protein with minimal impact. So thank you very much, guys. And if you have any questions, put them into the chat box.
Thank you, Frank, for your presentation. Very interesting. I see that you've generated a lot of activity in our chat section, so people are very curious about IMTA. First of all, you mentioned that IMTA is a relatively novel concept here in European aquaculture. Do you think that IMTA has a future in Europe, and what might that look like?
Yes, I believe it does, but as I sort of mentioned that, I'm not sure if it's going to be economically driven. I believe that it'll be driven by regulators or consumers, where we're talking about a reduction of impact. Regulation is likely to internalize the waste issue with the farm and to make it something whereby farms need to develop methods to reduce or to reuse their waste. So I think that will be a driver that's going to make IMTA a viable option for people to look at and to figure out how it's done. There is the potential for a carbon sink. Seaweeds are particularly good and at absorbing carbon and grow faster, but it very much depends on the fate of the carbon sequestered within the seaweed. So that is an option. How do I think it will look? I think we sort of hinted at there, I think that cooperative approach to IMTA will be the way to go. I'm not sure if it makes sense for a mussel farmer or an individual fish farmer to be adding other species and then to try and farm those multiple species. I think it makes a lot more sense for mussel farmer, a finfish farmer, a seaweed farmer to cooperate collectively and operate all their farms on the one site as individual or a cooperative group, rather than trying to learn new expertise and bring it on board. And then there is also probably the opportunity for the niche, more greener environmental product, the IMTA product that sort of goes beyond organic. And I think that has the potential, and it's probably where the first steps in IMTA will sort of progress in Europe.
Okay, so in your opinion, what is needed to progress IMTA within the European aquaculture?
There's a number of things, and I think probably starts with the scientists. I think we need to better establish the environmental credentials of IMTA to understand the ecosystem or service provided and to quantify the actual ecosystem benefits. to make it easier for the farmer to know what's going on and for the regulator to understand what's going on. I do believe on it we have to shift the currency from exclusively economic to a currency of ecosystem services and put value on the benefits accrued by IMTA. And I think really for it to go large scale, I think that's the key one. And that sort of has happened, we'll say, in something like organic, where it's costing more to do, but it's still worth doing. So you're shifting the currency isn't all, as big a concept as it sounds. The change from the waste of systems being external to a farm to becoming an internal factor that's likely to be addressed in all industries in the relatively near future. And I think when that happens, that's a driver for the farm themselves to try and figure out how they're going to deal with this internal waste problem. And we do have to build the markets for produce. Seaweed, many of the sort of lower trophic species have relatively small markets or new products. We have to figure out how to put a market value on them. So I think those are probably the key needs to progress IMTA.
Yeah, great, thank you. And this might be a bit out of scope, but in your opinion, what are some of the alternatives to IMTA?
The alternatives to IMTA is really continue as we're doing. Do nothing. So we stick with the current process and we look at where we're going to go if we do that. Will growth continue to be possible as environmental regulation tightens, as things like our costs to the environment become more? We're going to have to figure out, are we going to have to do something about our fish waste? Will regulation force us to do that? And if we're doing, how can we deal with that? Do we reduce the size of our farms? Do we go on land? Do we stop farming altogether? So the current models of monoculture we have and externalized waste into the environment are going to be challenges for the future. I think there's alternatives really are ways of how can we extract that from the environment. And I think exploring IMTA is the key way to do that.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I think we're going to move on to our next presenter. We have a lot of questions to you, but we will be saving them for the final Q&A section so that you can rest your voice for a little bit, and we'll come back to you. So if for those of you who sent in questions to Frank and haven't had them answered yet, we will return to them. So don't worry yet. Thank you so much, Frank, for your presentation. We will be moving on to the next topic, which is Ras. And to talk about Ras, with us today, we have Jacob Bregnballe as our Ras expert. So to introduce Jacob, Jacob, you have been the sales director of the land-based division at Aqua Group since 2007. You are a well-known expert in recirculation aquaculture system, and you hold a master degree from the University in Copenhagen in Denmark. So Jacob has a strong background from designing and engineering aquaculture projects around the world for more than 30 years. He's also gained extensive experience from research and development projects, working closely with universities and institutions in several programs for aquaculture. Jacob has a strong commercial background from managing his own land-based and cage-based business for 20 years before joining the Aqua Group. He has worked as an international aquaculture consultant for the FAO under the United Nations and is the author of A Guide to Recirculation Aquaculture by the FAO. An impressive resume, and I think we will be just as impressed with your presentation, Jacob. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Maren. I'll just share the screen. I think this should work now. So I guess it's okay. Everybody can see my presentation. And I'm going to bring this talk about recirculation a little bit onto the ground. You could say reality on the ground is actually the theme of my presentation. First of all, thank you for inviting me to do this speech. My first slide is just the agenda. So I'm just going to brief you on this, what's going to come. And first of all, some RAS key points, then a little bit about what's up and down in this discussion.
I'm sorry, Jacob, are you sharing your screen now? Because we can't see it.
Okay, we'll try again then. Do you see it now?
No.
it does show that it is shared here. We'll try again now.
There, now it's up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll just repeat what I said. I'm going to do this speak on the reality on the ground to bring this RAS discussion a bit more into what's actually going on, and not just reading books, but actually being in practice here. So I'm just going to take you through the agenda first, which is the key points of RAS as such, and then a little bit about what's up and down, and all the potentials and risks, and then trying to give some views on how to make a success story. Now, I'm going to show you this black and white photograph. We don't see many of these, but this is actually from 1962, the year I was born. And it's actually the farm I grew up on, because this is the Danish Trout Culture Research Station where my father was director. So me and my two brothers were running around on this fish farm feeding fish. And this is ordinary flow through, water running in one end, running out of the other end. And this is some 60 years ago. When I was around 30, I was running my own business. And here you see me with a steelhead trout, and then cage farming. And I was doing a lot of digging to build farms and so on. I had my own land-based farm. And this is actually how I got into recirculation, because I found out that recirculation actually worked wondrous compared to ordinary fish farming in many ways, but I'll get into that. And now today, I'm actually working on executing several large projects around the world, mainly in the salmon industry, we have to admit, but we have been working also in Saudi Arabia, Middle East, in general, Chile, of course, and other countries producing fish. We have tried to be into China and so on, but left it as such for now. So these are just some examples of those giant projects that we are working on today. But just taking a view back, what are actually the key points of RAS? As many of you will know, when we do RAS and recycle the water, we have fully controlled conditions. And that is, of course, really the big benefit of recirculation aquaculture. Then what does that give you? It actually gives you exact production planning, because you know how fast will your fish grow, or your shrimp, or whatever you're growing in your RAS. Because you know your temperature today, you know it tomorrow, you know your oxygen content and all these things. And before you take the water into your RAS, you should, of course, disinfect it thoroughly. And by that, you reach a high biosecurity, also making sure that you don't get visitors in with dirty boots and this kind of thing. And the fourth very important thing is saving water. I mean, in general, you just save a lot of water when you're doing recirculation. And that is also on top of the agenda nowadays, especially when you're talking freshwater environment. And then, of course, control of discharge. I mean, doing recirculation, you get much more in control what you are discharging. If we look at the challenges, well, first of all, it's, and sorry, pardon my French, damn expensive to build a recirculation system. And you really need capital to do that. And one of those things that we also see is, of course, once you have built it, it also costs you quite a lot of money to run the farm. So why would you build a recirculation system? And I will get back to that. Also, you need, of course, high farming skills, because now you're not just taking care of the fish, you also need to, you could say, calibrate and run and operate the system as a whole to make this reuse water system work. And then at the end of all this, well, you could say it can be hard to make it profitable. But I'm going to give you some views on this. Well, if we just look at the system for anybody attending this seminar who would not know what RAS actually is, it is, you could say, a recirculation of water. And I'll just try to see if I use this laser pointer, that you have the water going out from the fish tanks. It goes into mechanical filtration, and they're into biological filtration to, you could say, change ammonia into nitrate. And in this system, a little bit of ozone is added, and then the water is degassed to take out the CO2. And then you reuse the water by sending it through some oxygen cones to get enriched water with oxygen into the fish tanks. And then you just keep on doing this, and the water is actually recycled once per hour in general. It can be sometimes twice per hour. Sometimes it takes a little more than an hour to recycle it. But that goes on 24/7. And of course, you have feeding system and so on to make sure that you have your fish in well condition all the time. What we can do nowadays is we can put on a loop, which we call a zero water concept, and it's to minimize the water consumption. Before, in this one you saw here, you have 10% new water per day of your total system volume that you use. And if you put on a zero water concept, you get down to just around 1% of new water into your system. So that means that, for instance, you would exchange your whole water system in volume of water in 1 month it would take to exchange all the water. So that is significantly reducing. And what do we do? Actually, we take the water from the drum filter, and then we collect the sludge here, take that out, and then we denitrify to get rid of the nitrate. And we do also a phosphorus removal before we actually reuse that water. So that is what we call zero water concept. If we look at the whole system here, you see the Ras, which is this one, water turning this way, and the loop for the zero water here. And then, of course, at the end, you could put up belt filter, you could do decantering centrifugal, and to get this sludge and the reject water out at the end. So then at the end, you'd have sludge and you'll have some reject water. And it's actually at a controllable rate, you could say. If we go on and look a bit, how does that actually look? This dirt, well, this is from the band filter. That's one way of removing it. Another way is using these coffee filters, where you actually pour dirty water into these kind of coffee filters, and then the reject water will leave these, and you will still have the sludge in there. And then you can call on your local truck to come and empty these and take it to biogas or use it as fertilizer on farming land. And that way you actually get a very sustainable production. But anyway, what's up and down? I promised to speak a little bit about that. And now you really need to, listen carefully, because what is actually the strength of recirculation? And this is important. It is growing big fish when they are small. And you may say, what is the guy talking about now, growing big fish when they're small? That's because small fish, they have a very high growth rate compared to large fish. So a small fish may grow 2.5% of its body weight per day, whereas a big fish maybe only grow 0.5%. So you should put your investment in growing the small fish. That is actually the prime benefit of recirculation aquaculture. It actually counts for many species, or all species in aquaculture, that you should really be careful about the juveniles and grow them and spend your money when you're growing juveniles. The rest, as is often said in literature, is relatively straightforward. So small fish, they are vital for production of the larger fish and to make the profit in the end. As it said, good start is halfway to success. The challenge, on the other hand, is growing fish to market size. I mean, taking them up to a juvenile stage, and that can be smolt or it can be sea bass or bream, is relatively easy. But making a profit of this, you could say, market size fish is incredibly difficult at times. So, and that is actually because you have a high standing stock, you have a lot of fish in your system, and the cost of making these fish just swimming around and keeping them alive is very high, and you only have maybe a growth rate of 0.5%. So it is a big difference growing big fish in recirculation. So the reality on the ground is that small fish, you could say, for further on growing, that is a success. It's already proven to be a success. We see these systems all over the place for trout, for salmon, for bass, bream, and many other species. But the production of market-sized fish, that is really hard to make profitable. So if you were going to go into it, it would be, you could say, seen from a biological point of view, better to grow smaller fish at market size than bigger fish. But on the other hand, yellowtail kingfish and large salmon fetch a higher price than portion-sized trout, rainbow trout, for instance. So what are then the potentials and risks here? Well, if we look at a real potential today, you have the production of large smolt, and we have to say that is really a success story as such, and it's still a potential because the smolt get bigger and bigger, and the efficiency, and you could say it also reduces time at sea is really worth considering. So that's why we see that smolt are going from maybe 70 grams when they went to sea till today maybe up to ½ kilo or even bigger. And that's still a small fish because a big salmon is 4 or 5 kilo, and a juvenile salmon is only, let's say, 500 grams. And for those of you who do not maybe know the details of cage farming, but today it's a highly developed industry, you could say, and it's a big business. And there's really an interest in growing big smolt to avoid problems at sea. Another potential that I could bring forward here is the Danish trout recirculation aquaculture system model. This story at least showed that it was possible to go from this flow-through photograph I showed at the beginning to recirculation technology. But farmers in general would always ask, also in the EU, why should we be going for modern technology? There really has to be an incentive, and if you're struggling, it can be difficult. So you really need to make a way of thinking here and to work smarter to make it happen. So question is actually, could we copy this Danish trout model farm concept within the EU? It could be for other species, but it could also be for trout or Arctic char or other fish. And it could be even made so that you still cover these recirculation aquaculture farms, or model farms as they're called. But there is a significant production in Denmark of portion-sized fish this way, and also bigger fish. A risk example, because it's necessary, also important to address the problems here. That is struggling with profitability, at least in large salmon production. We see many projects and a huge interest of building big farms of 5,000 tons or 10,000 tons per year production of big salmon of 4 or 5 kilo. It's very high capex. The OPEX are high because you also have to chill the water. And as said, the growth rate is pretty low, only by 0.5% for these big fish at the end, and that makes it hard to make it profitable. On the other hand, it is a good market. The price is good for salmon. I know it goes up and down, but in general, you can actually fetch high prices. And in some markets, you can fetch a premium price with a land-based product or a RAS product. So if we think what could be the options, would there be other species that we could grow? And you could argue that you could grow shrimp, as you see in certain parts of near European big cities. You could grow new species like sunshine bass. We see big projects like yellowtail kingfish, and these are kind of, I would call, special productions. You could also produce pike perch and so on. But I think here the question is really, do you have the skills to grow these fish? And you also need volume. And I would still consider these as being niche products. Of course, you could do the big salmon farm near a city, but we see a lot of that also. Mass production, For hypermarkets, for instance, rainbow trout is a good example. It could be Arctic char in the future, or it could be bass and bream also. And now we're talking recirculation, actually. I'm not saying that it's going to be feasible because there will be competition from the sea. And it could be yellowtail. I put yellowtail here also for mass production. And I could have put in salmon as well, but now we're talking other species as such than salmon. So this is all a subject for discussion. Do we want to go for special production or mass production? And I think if we look at how to make a success story, what we do normally, we assess the project. So we would typically go in and say, all right, what's your farm technology? If it's RAS, what size of fish will you grow? What kind of technology will you use to grow these fish? Second here, and really important, just as important as the technology, is the team, the people working with this fish farm. Do they know what they're actually doing? I mean, do they know how to farm fish? Is it a well-working team as such? I mean, people is really important. And then the market, of course, for selling the product. That is key, that you have a good market to sell into. And authority handling, and by this I mean really permits. Are local authorities or central governments eager to have fish farming in the country or in this location? Working well with the local governments is really important. And then, of course, investment. I mean, do you have the money? Can you find the money? Can you find investors? So these are the 5, I would say, key points that I would use if I'm to assess a project. So by finalizing this also, I would say that I think we should consider both sides in this game. I mean, there are all the small farmers from eastern part of Europe to western part, north and south, and there are a lot of small farmers making local supply, organic farming, farm gate sales, and fish for recreational, maybe angling and so on. And I think they would benefit a lot by reusing the water. They could produce more. It would be environmentally safer, you could say, and better. So, and that really has to be considered. And then there's the other part, that is this large industrial production and using advanced RAS, where it's really, you know, only using 10% new water per day or something like that. And that requires that you go up to large scale, like 2,000 tons per year for your site. And then you really need a strong financial backing also. And then lastly here, I would say marketing of the product is key. I think that's really just as important as the people, the system, how it works, and then your marketing effort. So I think I'll end my presentation here and just say that I hope there will be a 2022 version coming up from the guide, or at least I'm working on it right now. So I hope I will have an edition update next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob, for a very, very fascinating presentation. So just a couple of follow-up questions. It also is a very hot topic right now, and there's a lot of buzz about it, but how mature is the RAS technology actually?
I think if you look at the core of RAS, which is this treating the water and cleaning the water, it is very mature sector. I think what we see now, we see a switch from the technology of cleaning the water, which has been in focus so far, to walking into the tank whole room, where you actually are grading your fish, where you are making the whole husbandry of your farming effort. That's where we need to focus. But technologically, seen from a biological point of view, it's safe and sound, and it's really well developed. But we still have some things to go. It could also be like keeping exact temperatures, or more precision feeding, precision in grading your fish, and these kind of things. So that still remains to be developed.
And if you want to start working with Ras, can you build it anywhere, or are there some things to consider regarding, for example, location or other considering factors?
Yeah, well, in principle, you can build it anywhere. I mean, we have built a farm in the desert in you could say, in Saudi Arabia and so on, and we have built Ras, these places. We built one in Iran quite recently, and that is in the desert there. But it's always good to see if in that location would have some, you could say, call it competitive advantages. For instance, a very good water source, because although that we can disinfect the water and so on, it is good to have a good basic of water. Another thing is you can use water for cooling. If you have cold water, access to cold water, you can use that for heat exchanging and cool your water that way. And of course, if you build a farm in the middle of the desert, you could say that your system will warm up. So maybe that's not the best place. And then again, coming back to having local authorities who are really backing you up, who wants to support you. And the other thing is then the market. I mean, I visited quite recently a shrimp farm in Munich, and they are selling shrimp in Munich, and they are having the farm right outside Munich, and thereby they have this good market, and probably not just selling for the beer festival, but all year round.
Great. You did mention some other species for Ras, and I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on which species you consider becoming possible success stories in Ras for market size fish.
Yeah, and it is very interesting, because when I started as a young biologist with my thesis growing different fish species, I was very interested in and fascinated what different species can we actually grow in aquaculture. And I would say you can grow any species, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there are some species that are just better suited for aquaculture than other. Like if you take, I find I've personally been doing cod in recirculation, really hard fish to do, and you're up in competition with the commercial cod fishing, so your prices will go up and down. And there are a bundle of fish species mentioned, but I have actually, as I come of age, being more boring, you could say. And I would say that if you want mass production, you know, to feed people, you should go for species that are really good in aquaculture, that behave well in aquaculture, and that also have been proven to sell well in the market. And if you look broadly, people are actually very conservative to what they eat. So when they go in the hypermarket, they would buy the salmon because they know the salmon. If you start bringing in new species, unless the price is really low and cheap, they will not buy it. So marketing is, of course, a part of this. The other part is biology. So you have to consider these things when you go and pick and say, right, it could be this one or it could be that species. So I would go back and say, well, a lot of the trout species, like, why don't we sell much more trout in the EU, for instance? It's a perfect fish as such, or it could be sea bass and bream, but it's a question of doing it, and I'm sorry to use that word, industrialized, but that is the way things are being done. And then there's the other part, and that doesn't mean that we cannot have that, which could be crayfish or clams or mussels and other things, which is a sector on its own, which is beyond what I know about. But that's, of course, also comes into this equation. So there's a lot of possibilities, but still, if you want to make it profitable, you really have to narrow it down to something that proves successful or has already proven being successful. Otherwise, you're just climbing mountains like I was in my 20s.
Yeah, and when you want to sell the fish produced in Ras, it has been some issues or some talk about off taste as a problem in Ras. It's often mentioned as a problem with Ras produced species. Could you elaborate a bit on this?
Yes, that's true. I mean, maybe most of the audience here know when you catch a fish, for instance, a carp, you've been out fishing, or it could be an eel, and you come home and you eat it, and it tastes earthen. It has an off taste. And we at times experience the same thing in Ras. It's not always like that, But when you produce fish in RAS for markets, of course, it will not happen in a smolt production, because then you put them at sea and you don't have off-taste problems in cage farming. But if you keep them in this enclosure and reuse the water, this geosmin, as it's called, can build up in the system, and it's absorbed, you could say, into the fish, and then you get this off-taste. We know very well how to, you could say, get the taste out, because that's a question of purging and leaving the fish for a week approximately in clean water, and then the taste will disappear. So it's possible to take out the taste. So as such, that's not an issue. The problem is that if RAS gets a bad reputation because people or farmers do not recognize this as a real problem, and then you get consumers who get this, I would say, terrible off-taste. And we have seen examples of that in the industry. And I think it's very good, Maren, that you address this, because it is really important that the product is a superior product, and it can be tackled. So I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be done when it reaches the farm gate and for further distribution.
Thank you so much, Jacob. A very interesting topic. I think we will close the presentation part, and we were going to move on to the questions from our audience. Thank you, Jacob. So thank you to all our speakers for very interesting presentations. And for those of you who asked, the presentations will be shared on the EUMOFA website in the next days. And if you want to know more about IMTA and RAS, please check out the EUMOFA publications, which we provided links to in the chat, and they're also available on our website. And if you want to stay updated on other EUMOFA publications and events, please subscribe to our newsletter, which we can provide a link to in the chat as well. So let's move on to the questions from our audience. There's been a lot of activity in the chat log. So I think the first question, it goes to you, Birgit. It's from Ola. How will the Commission support small-scale aquaculture to better take part in results from EU research?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As I explained, we will have this assistance mechanism, and the assistance mechanism will include a website with a knowledge base that is accessible for all the stakeholders, including small-scale aquaculture farm. And it will include results of EU-funded projects, and they are clearly explained there. The strategic guidelines also mention that is another action that I have not touched upon. So one of the key areas is also increasing knowledge and innovation. And under this key area, one of the actions that is mentioned is that that the Commission will foster solid dissemination and exploitation plan for EU-funded research and innovation projects. So the Commission will do a specific effort to better disseminate and exploit the research results from the EU-funded research projects.
Thank you, Birgit. The next question, I guess, is for Frank. It's from Jonas Harald. What does IMTA look like in low salinity or freshwater environments? Is there any research being done on this?
Yes, there is. Okay, so within the impact project, we had a industrial partner, Chamley, who are based in Turkey in the Mediterranean. And in general, the Mediterranean is oligotrophic, so you really need to pick your species and position them well. The Chamley partners were growing mussels and seaweeds. They had a real challenge. To get any significant growth, they had to have them very adjacent to the pens, as in really, really close. Our modeling work similarly predicted that growth would be quite low at that site for the species they have. Currently, they're looking into other species, Gracilaria species, to see how that works on their site. So it will be a bigger challenge, because particularly in an oligotrophic environment, because the nutrients aren't there in the environment by itself to support the growth. So you really have to do a bit of work and figure out what species might be the most appropriate for the site.
Thank you. And actually, just following up on that, you mentioned the impact project. Bruno is wondering if the impact produced any recommendation on space allocation. So, for example, how many surface of fish for how many surface of shellfish for how many surface of algae, and about the social acceptance of this.
Okay, the project did do some work on the bioremediation elements to put quantities on the extractive potential. And those are currently being written up by the partners and due for publication. Our partners, Deltares, which is probably more appropriate for this question, developed an IMTA model, which would help predict what quantity and what balance of species you would need on your site to get a good IMTA balance regarding nutrients. And then that would be used to calculate the volume of each of the species you would need. But in most cases, these are very site-specific parameters. So you would need to explore your site with the parameters for your site. And if you're looking for information on the Deltares model, check out the Impact website. They'll have information there and contacts there. So it's very site-specific to put numbers on what's needed.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. And then a question to Jacob from Jason Holland. How does the CO2 footprint of Ras salmon compare with traditional cage farming?
Yeah, I just read that question in the comments, but I think it's not a question I can answer. I can just give you some views on it. In general, CO2 footprint in aquaculture is lower than in other farming in general. So I would say that's the baseline of this discussion. Having said that, it's of course everyone would understand that the use of electricity in Ras would be a major contributor to CO2. On the other hand, I would like to say that now we are building a farm in my company Aqua Group now next to Shanghai. So instead of air transport of these salmon head-on gutted from Norway to Shanghai, we actually save a lot of CO2. But that's, I understand, of course, another story than benchmarking cage farm towards Ras. But I think that this benchmarking in some way is, I mean, I don't see land-based salmon farming becoming 50% of the world's salmon production. That may become 10% in the future at max, I think. But still, it could be interesting to do it, but I have not heard or seen such an investigation.
Okay, thank you. Another question to you, Jacob, from Panos. Would the return on investment be improved if Ras was used to grow fish, for example, until the juvenile stage or just before adult, and then move to traditional cage aquaculture? And also, thank you for a great presentation.
Thanks a lot. Yes, and I think that's what we see. We see, and I have to admit, I saw that when I built my first, you could say, juvenile Ras, that I simply just had a better bottom line on my farm overall. And that's what you see the big companies in salmon farming, what they see today, and you see it in other sectors as well. When you grow a bigger fish, and let me take the example of the salmon industry because it is such an excellent example. Growing a bigger fish before you put it out, it makes a stronger fish. You utilize, you could say, these 14 degrees that you can have inside your Ras compared to only 10 degrees maybe at sea. So you have a fish that's growing much faster, it becomes stronger, and then you put it into the sea, and then it grows for the rest of its life in the sea. So it does make an impact. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. And for us, we can see, we used to build the Ras systems, which would be for fish that would be 100 gram. Now we're building Ras systems for fish that would be 500 gram. So as you saw of my photographs there, our projects is today 5 times as big, or the one behind me, as they were before, some even 10 times as big. And that's because it makes, you could say, makes sense in return of investment to do this, call it trick, and to find just the tipping point. Where does it make sense to put out this big juvenile fish, I would call it.
Yes, great, thank you. Let's go back again with some questions to Frank. So the question is, IMTA is certainly an interesting production setup built in reality, but in reality, we've seen very little of it developing, at least in the EU and Americas. Why? Usually, a company producing one species has no expertise and or interest in the others. What are the incentives to get farmers together? These are needed. And that's a question from Alessandro.
Yeah, two really excellent questions regarding IMTA. So why have we not seen it develop in the EU and America? And I think the obvious answer is economics. It's IMTA. The IMTA model is not necessarily an economic model. It's an environmental model that we have to consider how we're going to do that. If you're currently a fish farmer and you're planning to invest €1 million, your accountant is going to advise you to expand your fish farm with more fish rather than to add seaweed. So that's going to be where that is. As I sort of suggested, we have to change the currency a little bit. If the currency becomes environmental, then the investment makes more sense. There's the possibility that you will have a more greener product to market that'll add your economic value, but we have to figure out how to balance the economic and the environmental bit and change that currency. So then you said, what was it? Usually a company.
Usually a company is only producing one species and has no experience or interest in other species.
And this is, I think, is key to what we've been doing so far. Much of the research I've read about what's happening is we're basically working on a finfish site and we're trialing adding species to it and seeing how they work. And I think that's the model we all have of IMTA in our head. That is a challenge because if you're a finfish farmer, you're not a seaweed farmer or a shellfish farmer or whatever you're going to be adding on. So therefore, I see the model as more of cooperative, of bringing in the experts for each of those to work together. And I sort of see the concept of we have to think of an IMTA farm so that each species in the management of the farm and in the heads of the people working on the farm has equal relevance, not just a finfish farm with seaweed, because I think that creates an imbalance. Are there incentives to get people to do that together? Not that I know of yet. And it goes back to, I think there'll be a few drivers there around the changes of environmental pressures to internalize your waste and how we deal with that. Those kind of things will be drivers, but they're not there yet. And we probably need a little bit of both a carrot and a stick, a little bit of encourage investment, encourage people to collaborate together and figure out these environmental problems, as well as the tightening of environmental regulations, which are happening anyway in the general EU and industry area.
Great, thank you, Frank. And this question might be to Birgit, but you others can feel free to answer as well. What label or certification can Ras or IMTA producers get to validate their sustainability to the market or investors?
Yes, as I said, Ras is not allowed under the organic EU organic label. Closed Ras, I mean, semi-closed might be allowed. But for the labels, it would be private certification. There are several private certifications that could be a possibility.
Thank you, Birgit. Some more questions about the Ras, Jacob.
Yeah. Ready.
Base and bream apart from Ras for hatcheries and pre-growing phase could be sustainable for market size. So I guess the question is related to sea bass and sea bream, more than just hatcheries and pre-growing out, if that could be available, growing it up to market size. Yeah, that's a question from Irene.
Well, I think it's one of these things where we could say if you build up a business, which is a large business producing marketable size sea bass and bream, would that be viable? And I believe that you need to get up in scale like 2,000 tons or so per year to be competitive. And I think it's the question again is, the competition is actually, you could say, towards cage farming. So would it be viable to produce these fish on land? And again, I think this very much comes each time to, do you have a product that fetches a high price? So it is very coherent with having this access to the market. And if you then can create a constant supply of a constant product, and you can maybe brand your RAS product in the way that it's what we see, for instance, in Japan, things, and I know that Japan is not the EU, but we just see people really wanting fish, and it's maybe a little crazy that they want them to come from this safe environment and not from the wild, because they're scared of things coming from the wild. They can have parasites and all kinds of things they believe, yes, and then they want it from this sterile environment. And then the question is really, because there's no doubt that it will be difficult to meet an operational expenditure that is as low as it is in Turkish or Greek aquaculture who's supplying into that market. On the other hand, we know there are periods where you have high prices and low prices. So it's not a question that I could say, yes, go for it. But I can only say that we have clients who are seriously considering it. And for instance, in the Middle East, just to take you away from the EU, this is being done as we speak, because they see it and they don't have the same possibilities as growing fish in the sea because of other reasons.
Thank you, Jacob. And going a bit away from the EU again, Frank, is there any implemented combinations of species for IMTA suitable for the Mediterranean Sea?
Yeah, sort of address that a little bit with the Chamley site. It very much is dependent on your site. The challenges with the Mediterranean is that it has quite low nutrient levels. So the concept of IMTA very much, when you're putting on your species, they very much rely on the waste product of the fish to grow. So you have to make the biological connection between those much tighter. And sort of in the Atlantic, there's already nutrients in the water. So if the biological connection isn't as tight, they can actually absorb the nutrients that are there naturally. So you really have to do a bit of modeling on your site, identify species that are appropriate for the nutrient level you have. And things like the Deltares model developed with an impact would be useful tools to do that. They actually did develop that model for the Chamley site in Turkey, which is just off Izmir and the coast there. So that there are tools available to help you identify what species may work quite well for your site.
Thank you. And this is a question to everyone. So, but maybe especially to Frank. So we know that growing mollusks can reduce nutrients in seawater, and the Baltic Sea is in serious trouble both with, and if I remember, N and P levels, and if I remember my high school chemistry, that is nitrogen and phosphorus levels. What can EU member states or municipalities do?
That is a challenge. I would start off, guess the first thing you need to do is to identify and to quantify the potential remediation that the mussels or species you're using may offer, and then calculate that to figure out what size of development would be needed to make an impact on the overall levels within the bays you're talking about. I know that the guys in Impact, the guys in the North Sea farms in the Netherlands were working on their seaweed farming off coast in an environment like this, where they're actually trying to reduce the overall nutrients in the bay rather than rely on the sort of IMTA model of the nutrients coming directly from fish in the vicinity of the site. They have quite a bit on their website around that, so that's the North Sea farms in the Netherlands. What can EU and member states and municipalities do? That I'm not exactly sure at that level. It would be beyond my expertise, but I think as if you can bring the science of the potential remediation, what's exactly needed to achieve that, and bring that to them and see where you can go from there. Maybe somebody else might be able to give a little bit more.
Oh, Frank, I have nothing to add to your answer there. I'm sorry.
It's good. We can move on. But maybe, Jacob, maybe you have an answer to this. This is a question from both Luca and Arthur. How resilient are Ras farm juveniles to diseases when they enter an open environment? Are there any studies that have looked into this?
Yeah, I'd say historically we have experienced that there were some problems, and it's really a relevant question because, as I said, if you have fish in a more or less sterile environment, I know it's not completely sterile, but at least no diseases or any challenge and so on, and then you put them out. We have seen that there were some problems in adaptation to this new environment. On the other hand, if you benchmark it to fish coming from flow-through systems, there weren't really a difference. These were special occurrences that happened. What we see now is that all fish are actually normally vaccinated when they're juveniles before they're put to sea. Not because that you fear that this is going to happen, but it's a general rule in many countries that you need to vaccinate your fish before you put them in the cages. So most juveniles, I would say, are vaccinated. So in that context, it shouldn't happen. On the other hand, it's also a misunderstanding that small fish, if you treat them real tough and hard, that they will be real hard fish and will, you could say, withstand difficulties later in life. That is actually a big misunderstanding. The better you treat your juveniles, the healthier they are, the stronger they are, and the more they will sustain for the future. So it is actually, I mean, you could say, being good and having high husbandry skills and so on is the best thing. And it's only when you put out a real sick or poor fish that have been treated bad or something like that for some reason, you know, that you experience these problems. So on the contrary, Ras should actually, and again, I would say with reference to the salmon industry, it's all becoming Ras now on land before they put them to sea. And there's a reason for that. And all those who were reluctant, they are switching.
But Jacob, you talk a lot about Ras, but we have a question from Katarina who asks, what's your opinion on fish farm built on shore, which take in water from the sea and discharge water into the sea? Could it be profitable? And for what size fish in this case?
Yeah, it is by all means possible. And I once had a company myself called Scandinavian Fish Farm Construction that was an expert on doing exactly that, because at that time we had this discussion. Should everything be moved on land? Should we have cages at sea, or should we combine things? So we started building some of these farms that's in question here. But my opinion, and what we also see, is that you don't see it much around. For that reason is that the way you should plan aquaculture in different countries and also within the EU is where you have access actually, and that's my personal belief, to good and sound, you could say, aquaculture. That may be mussel scallops, or it may be sheer cage farming for fish. You have very good areas where the location is perfect, it's not harming the environment, and there I think you should make the most of it. And then you should make some strong juveniles that you put out into these cages or these areas where you actually can make the most of Mother Nature's Mother Nature as such. So I understand the idea. I was myself very fascinated about the idea, but it doesn't really make a business, a growing business. It's simply the cost of doing these things, and you don't get the benefit of Ras just taking in water and letting it out again. It will still be a lot of seaweed. I can tell you, I had a farm like that. Seaweed that you have to deal with when there's a storm, all your water gets murky, and so on and so on. So you might as well go the full way to Ras, or you should go to sea. And what we see today is a combination of those two things, and not that in betweener.
Thank you. Following up on the question you had previously, where you talked about diseases in juveniles, there's a follow-up question from Luca, who asks, what about tolerance to environmental stressors such as heat waves?
Yeah, but I can say again an example from my life in fish farming. We had heat waves every summer in Denmark, trying to grow big fish out in cages. So in a Ras, that wouldn't be a problem. because of you of course, or not of course, but hopefully you have a chilling or cooling you could say mechanics standing there so that you can cool down the water. But looking at the sea farming, for instance, yes, this can happen, and we would be growing big rainbow trout in cage farming at 22, 24 degrees Celsius in the summertime, and this was almost lethal to the business as such, because you could say it is a heat wave, but that would come every summer. But so it is a risk. It's a risk that I would say is removed when you do RAS, but that should be an argument for building a RAS. I mean, still you have to do your assessment of your business.
Thank you, Jacob. And then there's a question to, I guess, both Birgit and Frank, and whichever one of you feels comfortable can answer it. It's from Dinaqua. And they write that here in Italy, we find that there is a amount of research in aquaculture, but at the same time, there is so much to be done in the field of diversification and creating an aquaculture as a business sector, especially small-scale businesses, which definitely need support. What are the intentions of the EU Commission in boosting technology transfer? Also, to substitute highly imported species, such as tropical shrimps, for example.
Yeah, I can say something on the funds that we have, the European Maritime, Fishery and Aquaculture Fund. So, apart from the shared management with the member state, there is also the budget of the MFAF that is directly managed by the Commission, and that can support businesses on innovative sustainable solutions, like, for instance, the so-called blue coals or the Blue Invest platform. So there are opportunities there. And then for the substitution of imported species, there are also, as I said, diversification is an important issue for the Commission. And we are also funding, we have funded a project under Horizon 2020, which was called Diversify, that was looking to new species for the diversification of species.
Thank you, Birgit. And Frank, you didn't get to talk now, but I have a question directly for you. That is from Ruel Bosma. And he writes, Dear Frank, what is your opinion on the bio-RAS that is making progress in Brazil?
I'm not sure, that might be for Jacob. I'm not sure I'm not really sure what exactly we mean there. So yeah, so maybe Jacob be able to have. But
you have to just, what did you say, Maren?
What is your opinion on the bio-RAS that is making progress in Brazil?
Yeah, it's a, you could say, in my opinion, it's too unstable. I know it is a low cost way of doing things, but the problem is that it is a little unstable. So that's my opinion as such. But I recognize that of course you can't every time build a superior RAS system. I've already argued that the capex, the capital expenditure is enormous building a RAS, so it's huge anyway compared to other ways of building it up. So I respect fully that people try other ways of doing recirculation aquaculture, and there should be room for it. But my personal opinion is, again, that, or I have just experienced that, if you do not compromise things and go for the full RAS, full-blooded RAS, you could say, you gain so much. On the other hand, there may be incentives in, you could say, doing it the other way around, like the bio-RAS.
Thank you. And one final question for you, Jacob, from Katarina. Eel RAS farms have higher nutrient concentration because of the feed. What could be done to lower the discharge concentrations? Or is it something authorities should take into account and eel farms should be regulated differently?
Yeah, but I think now if we're talking eel farming and recirculation aquaculture, and we don't see so much of this anymore, it's kind of a dying business, like, you know, you have problems with the eel in nature and so on, but it still occurs in some situations as such. I think it's important to look at the RAS as one thing, and the wastewater treatment as another thing. Because you can argue that you could build a RAS, and then if you don't have any wastewater treatment, it's polluting, just as much as a flow-through farm. So the idea here is to put on a wastewater treatment to your RAS, and that should always go together. The benefit of it being a RAS is that the water coming out of your RAS, and that is your sludge water, is only, 1/100th of, or maybe only 1% of what would normally come out of a flow-through farm. And that makes it possible to handle this wastewater coming from your RAS. And whether it's eel, trout, or any species, that doesn't make a difference. It's still just much more easy to handle this, whether it's eel, trout. The main importance is the difference, whether it's RAS or it's flow-through. That when it's RAS, it's just much more easy to handle your effluent.
Thank you, Jacob. Very interesting. Those were all of the questions that we had from our audience. So thank you to everyone who sent in questions. Actually, we have one more that came in, and we have time for one final question from Rod Wilson. How it's for you, Jacob. How easy is it to manage the denitrification and phosphorus removal system in Ras?
Yeah, question is always what is easy, and I think it's a very good question because people think that once you install something, it'll just work. Like your car, you don't pump your tires, or you don't. There are certain things that you have to do driving a car, fill on petrol and stuff like that. It's the same with denitrification. You need to fill on methanol. You need to dose the methanol that's used as a carbon source for this one. And then I would though say that it is pretty easy. If you have your daily routines, you write up your figures on, what is the level coming in and coming out, and adjusting your dosing of methanol, because this is about bacteria that needs a carbon source. And you need to make sure that this carbon source is there, and you need to make sure there's a flow through it. But you can't just leave it for a week without looking at it. You need to look at it twice a day or something like that, adjust a bit up and down the next day. So if you do that, I would claim it's easy. If you don't, it's going to be a hardship, it's not going to work. And it's not about because of the denitrification process, because we all know that works. It's because of the manager, the guy trying to run it and maybe not running it properly. So proper management, you get a proper result.
Right. Thank you, Jacob. And that was all the questions. So,
thank you.
Yes, thank you for answering, and thank you to everyone who sent in questions. So unfortunately, this talk has now come to an end, but I at least have learned so much new about IMTA and Ras and the Commission's strategic guidelines. So I remind you all that this talk will be available on the EUMOFA YouTube channel if you wish to listen to it again, and the presentations will be made available. And if you want to stay updated on other EUMOFA events, subscribe to the newsletter. So there's nothing left to do really, but to thank everyone who made this event possible. Thank you so much to our speakers, Frank, Jacob, and Birgit. And thank you to our behind the scenes crew in EUMOFA, Alessandro and Marco. And of course to the audience for participating with questions and listening to the talk. So thank you all for being part of this event. I wish you all a nice day and nice winter holiday season. Thank you.